Um, you can feel free to mute your video and we won't see your face if that is an issue. As Michael already said, he gave us his phone number. It's in the chat, and so that is easier if you want to make comments. The chat is open, but we'd ask you to use it sparingly, and I'll be monitoring it, but just know that we may not see it if it is in the chat. And what else do I need to say? I think that is pretty much it, other than myself and everybody really. We'll be monitoring everything, and if for any reason we need to pause and deal with any disturbances, we will, though fingers crossed we have not had that happen yet in this series, so we hope that continues. I am thrilled to have Michael Odegaard here with us this evening, who has worked with the United Nations, the University of Hawaii, and associated with Kumeyaay College to talk to us about his projects with preserving Indigenous languages. And so I will turn it over to Michael. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. And I see Sam's in the room now. I want to thank Sam also for sponsoring my first Zoom talk with the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Palomar. And I think it was through that the word got out to you guys. And I see some of my Rotary friends here today, and some of my friends up here in North County. It feels so good to know that you're all with us today, because this is my passion. So I guess without further ado, I will begin my PowerPoint. And let's see if we can get this going here. Okay. I need to go to the app. And how do I get this to start? Oh, here we go. Okay. Well, let me start with a greeting. I hope that we all will do. In Hawaii, when we start a presentation, we start with aloha. But since we are, since the first Unitarian Universalist church is in San Diego, I'd like us all to say, "Hau ka." This is the Kumeyaay greeting, and it goes beyond a land acknowledgement to also indicate that beyond the fact that this is their land, this is their people and their culture. And we say in Hawaiian, "O ka'olelo ke ka'au ka maoli." This is actually the motto of the Hawaiian language program at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. Our language is what binds us to our cultural identity. I'd also, before I start, in exchange for my presentation, I would beg your prayers for my mother, who I have not been given contact in the last 500 days, partially because I insist on my right to speak Hawaiian to her. When I went to Hawaii and started teaching Hawaiian language here in North County, it was really her invitation and her sense of obligation to the Native Hawaiian community here, and I'd like to continue doing that. But there are people who you can see listed who are making it difficult for me, and so I ask you to please pray for these people. I'd like to also introduce a few friends of mine who are with us in spirit. Beginning with Lili Uokalani, who is close to my family. Lili Uokalani was the last queen of Hawaii, and her teaching on aloha, forgiveness, and nonviolent protest literally saved the Hawaiian nation. And her teachings prefigured Mahatma Gandhi, as well as inspired Martin Luther King Jr. And then on the right, we have Saint Innocent of Alaska, also known as Saint Innocent Metropolitan of Moscow. He was a Russian Orthodox missionary priest, and then the first Orthodox Christian bishop and archbishop in the Americas. And finally, the Metropolitan of Moscow in all of Russia. And he's remembered for his missionary work, scholarship, and leadership in Alaska and in the Russian Far East during the 19th century. He's known for his abilities as a scholar, a linguist, and an administrator, and he learned several languages and dialects of the indigenous peoples. He wrote many of the earliest scholarly works about the native peoples of Alaska, including dictionaries and grammars for their languages, which he devised writing systems for. Also, he wrote religious works and translated parts of the Bible into several of these languages. And then finally, on the left, we have St. Nicholas of Japan. And I have a nice story about him. When St. Nicholas first arrived as a missionary in Japan, he set about studying Japanese language and culture, refusing to evangelize for almost a decade until he could do so with full knowledge of Japan. He studied its religion, culture, and language, frequently visiting Buddhist temples and public storytelling events to get a sense of the people. Unlike some who attempt to be missionaries, Nicholas truly attempted to appreciate what Japanese culture had to offer and not to dismiss it as backwardness. On Buddhism, he wrote, the teaching of the loving Buddha, of his readiness to save a person at the first call, at the inadequacy of a person's own powers to be saved involuntarily, amazes one. When you hear such preaching in a temple, you can forget where you are and think you are hearing a Christian sermon. Despite his fondness for Japanese culture, the Japanese were actually quite xenophobic at the time, and it was very difficult being a foreigner. At one point, when Nicholas was still studying, the samurai Sawabe Takuma came to Nicholas's home and pulled his sword, telling Nicholas that he was going to kill him before he could start his preaching. St. Nicholas responded with this threat of violence with peace. He asked the samurai why was he going to kill Nicholas before he knows what Nicholas would preach. So Nicholas proposed that the two sit together so that he might explain his message to Sawabe. And then at the end, so if Sawabe doesn't like it, he may kill Nicholas. The honorable samurai agreed. By the end of the conversation, however, Sawabe was convinced of the truth of Christianity and became the first convert, eventually the first Japanese Orthodox priest. Now, one thing that all three of these have in common is a prayer. They all knew a prayer that I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to show it to you in English while I pray it in Hawaiian in honor of Liliuokalani. E mo ilani, ke kukua ka uhane o ka oia i'o, ka mea ma nā wahi a pau a ho'opiha i nā mea a pau. Vai hona vai a me ka mea nana I ola aku. E hiki mai a I noho I loko mako, e ho'o mai a mako I nā hewa a pau. A I ho'ola I ko mako ma uhane, e ka haku loko mai kai e. So there are plenty of intrinsic reasons for the Kumeyaay to revitalize their language. There's also reasons for the rest of us and for people who will never meet Kumeyaay to be interested in this. And this is one of the ones that appealed most to me. Beginning in 2012, the World Bank came out with a statistic that has remained until this day, and that is that 80% of the world's biodiversity exists within the 23% of lands that remain under Indigenous management. Think about that for a second. 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity exists in the 23% of lands remaining under Indigenous management. Why? Well, it's within the Indigenous knowledge that we have the taxonomies of all the plant and animal life that have existed there for thousands of years. And so zoologists and scientists and have told us that we need to create partnerships with our indigenous communities for their survival. It's actually expected that by the end of this century, as many as, or as much as 90 to 95% of indigenous languages will disappear unless we do something seriously about it now. We all know Jane Goodall. She also reminds us that within the indigenous knowledge and worldview, we have a sense of time that is oftentimes not important in economic models that govern our economics today. So another benefit in indigenous knowledge, and I talked about this, is the knowledge and the worldview, the perspectives that you can learn in indigenous language that you might not get in English. English is a very technical and precise language. However, Hawaiian, being an ancient language, is different than English, in that English is what we call a subject-verb-object language, while Hawaiian is a verb-subject-object language, and this it shares with Mayan, Celtic, Arabic, Filipino, and Biblical Hebrew. When I say "Ike wau yaya," I see him or her or it, it means two things. It means not only that I see the object, but that I also see because of the object. And this is connected with the more relational worldview that the Hawaiian language includes, at the same time as having more of an analytical worldview. Another thing is that it's simpler. Sometimes, you know, I think there's 72 pronouns that I suppose we're going to have to learn, but Hawaiian, there's just one. And so, you know, if I have difficulties with English, I might just switch to Hawaiian. I don't say this out of any disrespect to anybody, but I'm just saying that I don't know if I'm going to be able to learn 72 pronouns in my lifetime. So while I was in Hawaii, I was teaching, I was volunteering at one of the Hawaiian immersion schools. And I got to, they put me in the second grade class, and it was really fun during flexible times to just play, you know, blocks with the kids. I would help them, you know, some of the slower in the class. But we really loved, just dreaming about the kinds of places we wanted to live in. And by the way, my background is in community design. I've designed communities in China, throughout Southern California, in Italy, Canada, Mexico. So the time came when they offered me the opportunity to share my knowledge with the students. And so I began to teach them the basics of urban design, starting with things like public and private, you know, and sometimes you have to teach these things in a way that are unoffensive to indigenous sensibilities, where they don't really have a strong sense of privacy. So I taught it from the standpoint, well, whose responsibility to take care of it is it? Is it a one person or a few, you know, a couple people, or is it the societies at large? Then we started talking about safe places, you know, what places, once we just decided what the places in one's community are, then we decided, well, where are the safe places to play? And so we talked about public spaces to play and private spaces to play. And then we took a look at the indigenous system of land subdivision called the Ahupua'a, which is a land subdivision running from mountaintop to the ocean. This type of land subdivision is pretty popular in the planning community. I wrote an article on this way back in the 90s that was used as the sustainable model for the Tejon Ranch subdivision master plan. And so what it does is that, you know, water is what unites all of the plant and animal life within a pie slice of land. And so it becomes a very strong vehicle of identity. You might have heard in Hawaiian a moke, which is kind of like an old boy or a local or what they say, I think well, anyway, it's a person who comes from a place and has a strong sense of loyalty to that place. Then we applied the language, the urban design knowledge, and applied it to the modern context of a modern city. And so what it did was it helped take the children from their indigenous worldview and then be able to apply that so that they would be able to participate in the urban arts and in the visioning of their land. So the students got a chance to design their favorite place to play. The girls chose, if you look on the lower left, or middle left, there's that big golf course. They got to design a water-oriented theme park. And right near where that dot is, next to the school, the boys got to design their Paka Papahuila, which is a skateboard park. So it was really a lot of fun. And then this is during Obama's campaign, and he was using social media, and I started something called Hawaii Bilingual. I just wanted to give voice to this wide felt need of ending the apartheid relationship between the indigenous and the colonial community. And so some of the local kahus, the indigenous kahus, asked me to take this message to a larger constituency, and they asked me to run for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs trustee, which is kind of like the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so I actually ran my campaign in Hawaiian, and the purpose was that, we can't expect the state of Hawaii to function bilingually until our own institutions can function bilingually. So I got 19,000 votes, and based on that, I wasn't expecting to win because I had just, come to Hawaii, but based on that, the trustees of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, just 2 months later, when it came to the time to choose a new president of the organization, they actually chose the underdog, who was the bilingual of the two finalist candidates. So I considered a successful campaign. And I want to give you kind of a sense of the feeling that the youth at this time had about the Hawaiian language. And this is through a slam poetry event that I think you'll enjoy.
Kauna means hidden meaning. It's a love poem to Hawaii and to the Hawaiian language.
Our language survived through the passing of flowers. In 1896, the last reigning monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, was held prisoner in her own palace.
Communication with the outside world was prohibited.
Newspapers were snuck into her room, wrapped around flowers.
The queen and her people wrote songs and stories hidden in Hawaiian.
So as to converse without the overthrow and provisional government knowing.
It is because of this we know our history, the language of hidden meanings, kauna.
The first written Hawaiian poetry.
Songs and dance were the medium which we decoded their denotation.
The language of commonality was no longer an option, so our oral traditions evolved as our words would die. The ones we promised to die for weren't surviving, so we sent our stories, wrapped our children in blankets of words, hoping they would honor to their meanings. With every story forgot, with a piece of our history. It's time to uncover the past and understand our future.
To interpret our stories, to better know ourselves.
So listen to me. Listen to me. Existence persists as long as we have language. If we cannot communicate with each other, we cannot survive.
He mana ko ka leo, a ina o he leo, a o he ola.
Without language, we have nothing. We must see to it that our language survives like the past through flowers. Ua ka olelo mai ka pai kuana o nā pua. E hiki nā pua e ola, mai ka pai kuana o ka olelo. So our children can survive. to the passing of language.
Pretty intense. But so there were multiple topics involved: the overthrow of a recognized government, but more even importantly, our knowledge of ourselves as Hawaiian people through our own language. And one of the things that you might have heard is the chant that was said, e ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o na mea huna no ia o na mele e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai. This was actually written by, it's a modern chant actually, in the traditional style, written by Edith Kanakaole. And it talks about how our knowledge of ourselves is in our chants, in our traditional cultures, and in those traditional cultures are those plants and animal species, the taxonomies and the values and the relationships that give us a sense of who we are. So in recognition of that, Auntie Kanakaole is actually one of 5 American women who will appear on the obverse side of the quarter coming out this year. And so we're very proud of her and her contributions to American culture, not just Hawaiian, but American culture, and this movement to recognize our indigenous languages so that they may be revitalized. And then we also acknowledge that when the Pope was in Canada last summer, I believe it was, he talked about, actually not while he was in Canada, but he as he was leaving on his plane, he said, in fact, what he witnessed at the residential schools was genocide, and it's not just physical death, but what he was alluding to was also the killing of a culture. And so this is a question, if people haven't been thinking about it yet, I would say a good swath of American society is now dealing with this, and we're now in the midst in California here of going through a truth and reconciliation for physical and cultural genocide, starting, well, obviously centuries ago, but specifically during the gold rush. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what is genocide. I don't believe anybody here is guilty of genocide, but this is a topic, the G word, we have to kind of talk about it so we can understand the trauma that Indigenous peoples face and deal with on a daily basis. So I'd like to start with acknowledgement of Raphael Lemkin, who co-authored the United Nations International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the first treaty that United Nations was that United Nations adopted. If you study him, you'll find in his early drafts he includes cultural genocide, but he actually had opponents that prevented him from including that term in the final document that was adopted. And so he talks about the 2 phases of genocide, really the destruction of a national pattern, not just people, but really the pattern of the oppressed group, and then the imposition of the pattern of the oppressor. And in his techniques of cultural genocide, he really focuses on linguicide. And that was, to be honest, I think that might have been implemented by some of our Rotarians back in the day, because, I think Rotarians, to help protect the contributors to society, would adopt codes to protect the way that they wanted to practice their professions. And those codes and licenses were all done in English. So if you happen to speak a language other than English, you were left out. And as I wrote my curriculum for the Hawaiian immersion schools, I began to realize as a planner that I could really no longer go back to that, knowing that we were only doing that in the English language alone, because as my own life showed, that I really had to give up until more recently any studies of my indigenous culture to be able to participate in that. And so this is the unfortunate thing that modern life does to indigenous peoples. To enjoy the benefits of urban life, we're forced to give up our cultures. And so the next person I want to talk about is Robert Joulin, whose book, White Peace, still hasn't been translated into English, but he talks about ethnocide. Because some of the controversy about genocide, he starts to explore from a sociological point of view what totalitarianism is, and this mechanism of assimilation, how it actually creates cultural genocide. But I think it's really important for us today, especially not because of the way our society seems to be fragmenting, is that the totalitarian mindset divides the world between us and them. And it causes us to objectify the other, which is very dangerous to our own souls as well as to the health of our society. So while I was in Hawaii, I actually got to host Mick Dodson. And after he went back to Australia, by the way, he's a part Yaruru and part Irish law professor. And he's one of the principal authors of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous, International Declaration of Rights of Indigenous, which for the first time used international law to establish standards that indigenous communities needed to have recognized for their own survival. And right after he left, he went back to Australia, and because of his success with finally getting this document adopted after 20 years, he was named Australia's Man of the Year. And I like to read some of the articles from it. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subject to forced, I can't read that part, subject to forced assimilation, right? States shall provide effective mechanisms for the prevention and redress for any action which has the aim or effect, as Jolin's talked about. I didn't really mention that, but Jolin was the first to talk about how sometimes it's the outcomes that are just as important as the techniques. And so it has both the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or identities. And any form of forced assimilation or integration, and any form of propaganda designed to promote or incline, I don't know what that says, but anyway, racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. And then Article 13 talks about how Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize and use and develop their languages. And 14 says they have the right to establish and control their educational systems and to educate within their own languages. And I'll talk a little bit about that, why that's really important. Indigenous also have the right to establish their own media in their languages, and that the colonial organizations have an obligation to contribute to the full realization of the provisions of the Declaration through various means. So one of the things, knowing Mick, was he gave me sort of the inside scoop on why it had taken so long, and why, in fact, the only 4 countries to oppose this was the prevailing colonial power of the Anglophone nations, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And so it had to kind of go through some changes that took out all references to genocide, and maybe for some good reasons. But in any case, just like the Pope described his experiences without saying genocide. And by the way, the reason why he couldn't say genocide was because, according to that first treaty adopted by the UN, whenever a head of state actually admits to genocide, then he must be arrested. So he had to wait until he was on the plane for him to actually use the word genocide. So that's probably the most important reason that genocide does not appear in the UN International Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Persons. So let's get to the present situation here in California. You can see that there's several families of indigenous languages. Let's count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then some isolated ones. However, only 6 of those are spoken today amongst 40 dialects. So in our area, we have the Uto Aztecan and the Yuman, which include the Kumeyaay and the Luiseno, and I'll call that the Luiseno group because there's 2 related languages to it. But we want to focus on the Kumeyaay since we're talking about San Diego here. And some of you know Dr. Stanley Rodriguez, who's a member of my Rotary Club, and his great work he's doing in documenting and teaching, revitalizing the language. And he speaks all over the world right now. He's one of the busiest people I know. He needs help. And the thing for us to realize is that this is not something that he can really do on his own, but we can help him create the conditions where his language has a chance of survival. And that's the important part. This is something that hopefully, we'll come to embrace as instead of trying to cover up our indigenous cultures or to push it aside, to welcome them back into our communities, and then to learn from them and make them a part of our processes when it comes to the regulatory missions of our cities and counties and states. Many of us are familiar with the factors that contributed to the objectification and genocide, beginning with our own nation's founding documents, Augustinian colonialism, inherited guilt. A lot of these things have been dealt with, in the last few decades. I won't go into too much detail other than just say that hold on, let me just move something here. That the major factors on a theoretical level that contributed to genocide pretty much have been dealt with academically, and they wait, incorporation to our laws. So the Declaration of Independence is there. We still, have problems for children who go to American schools and they see this. It's kind of shocking to see this merciless Indian savages, but until it's updated, it may have to be updated soon. It still exists. We have white nationalism and white supremacy, which we're dealing with now. The doctrine of discovery, which has been repudiated by most Western Christians, and then the various genocides that were finally admitted by our governor, Gavin Newsom, in 2019. So probably the most well-known institutions that contributed to the cultural genocide was the residential schools. And in the residential schools, there were stories of all kinds of abuse, but you might have heard the idea of let everything that is in you, that is Indian in you, die. This is the essence of cultural genocide, by killing the spirit. And so in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, they were still trying to do an integrated education system where natives were brought into the cities and educated in the schools. Well, they found that actually had for many, if not most, a very negative effect, because even though maybe the Indian schools were closed, it didn't mean that linguicide itself had stopped. There's both explicit and implicit linguicide that happens. And when an indigenous language is, even if it's just included as a topic, still the subtle message implicit in that setup is that your normal topics indicate what's really important. And until we actually achieve all Indigenous medium education, where all of the relevant topics are taught in the Indigenous language, our Indigenous communities are still going to feel like their languages don't matter to our society. So to kind of give you an idea of how these Indigenous language medium schools operate, I'd like to share with you this video that's kind of shows the state of the art of what exists right now in Hawaii, where Indigenous language education is available now by right from grades, really preschool, all the way through PhD.
Ka olelo ka mea e ho'opili ai poe ke kahi me ke kahi. He lahui a lokahi ma luna o ke kai ano no'o. O ka whaiole o kui no e aha o makahiki. No leila, no kākou ka poe Hawaii. Aia ma loko ka kākou olelo, ia mau au ka ike he Hawaii. Aloha, uilani ana hui noa, no hopa mapuna o sina. No leila, he kokua ka ike ana I ka olelo Hawaii. I ka hoi ana I ke la huana ike au.
The basic reason that you need to put an extreme amount of effort into maintaining Hawaiian is that English is so super overpowering in our contemporary society in Hawaii. So in order to make Hawaiian strong, you have to put an extra effort into that.
Nestled in Puna on the island of Hawaii, Ke Kula o Navahio Kalani o Pu'u is home to a preschool through 12th grade program pursuing academic success from a solid foundation in our language and culture.
Olelo no e au. Hea ka mana'o o keia, olelo no e au.
All modeled after one of Hawaii's legendary figures. Born and raised in the school's home of Puna, Joseph Koho'oluhi Navahio Kalani o Pu'u served his people in many ways as a legislator, a lawyer, and even a newspaper publisher.
E kuho'ohalike o Navahi ma muli o kona ano he kanaka aloha la hui o ka mua. A leila aloha aina, aloha a ho'ona'awao.
O ia ka waiwai nui o keia papahana o ka nu'ukia o ke kula I ko kakuola no ka mea ne'inei no.
The school is grounded in traditional Hawaiian ways of thinking, but its philosophy of education is anything but old.
Ale kākou ho'i I ke la wā, e ho'ohana I ke la, e lilo ke la o ia ko kākou ano.
Navahio Kalani o Pu'u is building on the state's existing Hawaiian immersion program to create a 100% Hawaiian medium experience.
Now, Hawaiian medium education goes beyond the classroom to include the entire school. And that means the librarian, the janitor, and the principal, everyone using Hawaiian as a language of the school.
Ka huli, hopili mai,
And that's really the idea of Hawaiian medium education, to be normal, to have Hawaiian language and culture normalized, to be on TV.
Aloha mai kako. He mea ko'i maoli no ke ia ninu nei pili na aina lia li'i.
To be in the grocery store. And of course, to be in school.
This all allows for a high level of fluency that's beneficial on many levels.
Well, first, there's a cultural benefit of being able to live your life in Hawaiian language from a Hawaiian perspective, totally from a Hawaiian point of view. However, there's also academic benefits. Research has shown to the world that children who know two languages really, really well have a cognitive advantage over all other children.
Nawahi leadership is working with institutions and agencies such as the Educational Testing Service to help develop valid and reliable measures that confirm these advantages of a Nawahi Hawaiian medium education.
Ka poe haku ho ike nui ko lako hoi I ka ike I ka poe oiwi e imi I kaika ana I ke kahi ho ike e ho ike ahu wale ana I ke aka mai o ke ia mau keiki e au ia nei ma loko o ka lako o lelo uiwi.
This cutting-edge educational opportunity involves and appeals to families young and old from a variety of backgrounds.
We wanted our children to have the experience of being educated in Hawaiian language and Hawaiian culture. We felt that having that experience would allow them to develop the other skills and academic success that they needed to be successful in today's environment.
Nui kahana, but it was worth it. And the thing is, my father's generation and my generation, we lost the language. So that's why we needed to bring it back. And the reason why I wanted Kopa to go to Olelo Hawaii School was to bring back the language in our ohana.
Ole ki ano na ohana a pau aka no mako ka poe I koho I kia ano ho na awao he mea nui loa ke ia no ke ola o ka ike o koka ko mau kupuna no kia hanao na wo.
For many of our ohana, this experience begins with the Punana preschool program.
Ke ano he no o kanaka o ka pepe ka manawa ke la pai pepe o ia ka wā e ho o maka ai.
That is the apple, right?
A me ka makau kau o ke kanaka. I ka ho'okele ana I kāna hana. Kāna lavena, kāna mau olelo, ka hiki ke ike mai kai, ka ho'opolo mana o ana, ke kia ana maluno ka hana, aia I loko ka olelo, kia mau mea holo.
The entire Nawahi environment fosters this way of learning, from the educational approaches and strategies to the physical environment as well.
In Hawaiian thinking, learning takes place everywhere. So the garden in that respect is one of our most precious classrooms here at Nawahi. Math is very abstract in that you have to, take numbers and crunch them. And that's what people typically think about math. The mala allows us to apply it to real life situations. So one example would be just measuring the growth of the uala plant, which then allows us to plan better with our certain gathering. It's not just going through the motions, but actually applying that knowledge to your work, to your life.
O ke kanaka na awao, o ke kanaka ike, o ia ke kanaka I hiki ke kālailai I ke kahi mea, ke kahi anu ike, po aia pili. Ua hiki pū I ke la kanaka ho'okahi, ke ho'ohana maoli I ke la ike ma ke kahi ana. Ohe vai o ka ike wale o ke po'o, a hiki ke wala au, a ka a'ale maopopo pehea e ho'ohana I ke la ike. No leila, o ka ike ku'una o ia ano no. Aloha ko'u ike no kia no ka mea ho'ohana wau ike.
And it's that practical application of traditional ways of thinking about contemporary content that's key to this Nawahi educational experience, an experience that culminates with a very unique graduation, a week-long program that involves the entire ohana.
Hau'oli loa wau me ka hopena, ke ia pule he hoi loa ia'u, me ka o keiki ka o ka ane ko ohana holo ko'a. O ka lei ke keiki mua ma ka ohana, tuka ana mai ke kai kula o lelo Hawaii. Nui ku mako ha'ahe o iaia.
O lapo I ku mea o no ko ola holo ko'a. Alela he mea nui ka ohana ia a ku ha'ahe o no lapo.
Mahea la e hele ai ke kanaka mahope o keia. He mea nui ka ho'omanao ana no hea mai. No ke aha, ka wahea, ka ohana a pela. A e ho'i mau mai I ka mo'o kua hau.
Kanani Kobai Aiomaka Imoku has a clear understanding of where she came from. She started as a keiki punanaleo and was a member of the very first graduating class at Nawahi. She completed her college education, including a master's degree in teaching, and has returned to Nawahi as both a teacher and a parent.
Watiare, polole. Wahala na makahiki henui aka mauno ka pono e komo makahana, ea. Aia mako makapapa mua aka ali pau kahana maka lapuka, kona e hoi mai a kokua a kako'o I na poki iho, na hanau na ho e puka nei. Ai, nana. O ka vaivai loa o kia anoa o ana, kia kaia o Mauli Hawaii. Oia no, ka ho'omako kauana I ka piko'u o na keiki ma kia kula. Ma laila e a'oai na keiki no ke aloha ohana, ke aloha ho'ona awao, ke pule ana, a ina pa'a ke la mau mea, ke puka aku mai kia ano kula. Hiki ke komo mana ano mea like ole, mana ano aina like ole, me ka hila ole I kona ano mauli.
Ke ike ia nei o na keiki puka mai Nawahi, na haumana puka mai ke kulanui aku ke olelo Hawaii nei me na pepe a la ko mai ka hanau ana. He ho'aino na maoli ke lau ke ola.
Ke kula o Nawahi o Kalani o Pu'u, a unique and progressive educational experience producing academic results, but even more importantly, providing an opportunity for families to be a part of revitalizing and sustaining our language and culture.
No leila, ina ho'omaka e hoi ka ohana I ke la ano, hana pu ana, alu like ana, hapai like ana I kekahi mea. E no kalailai ana ke la kanaka, ke la ohana I kona I kaika. He aha ka'u e hanai. He aha ka'u e lawe ai, e ha'awi ai. No ka pono o ka'u keiki, ka'u mau keiki a me ke lau. Ke ola kanaka ana, o kona wā hanau, a leila ka la e ha'alele ai, kona ka pau ana. O leila, nā hana ea pau I waina o ia mo la e lua, o ia nā la I pono e ho'ohana I ai ka olelo Hawaii. O ia ka pau hopu.
I'm trying to advance it. What's the matter here? Okay, let me see here. I'll have to escape, I think. Let me stop the share for a second. While I'm doing that, if we can take this opportunity to, if anyone would like to share any comments. I'd like to let you know that we can't expect this to happen immediately. This actually happened 30 years after the Hawaiian language was legalized. Hawaiian was illegal as a medium of instruction until 1986. So this was a long time coming. To find it. Okay.
Looks like
So
Marge.
go ahead.
Looked like Marge has a question. If you were taking those now.
Yeah, I'll take a couple now if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very fascinating. Is the Kumeyaay language somehow connected with the Hawaiian, or are you just sharing your experiences with the Hawaiian and that same kind of process should be used with the Kumeyaay?
Yes, in fact, Stanley's very enthusiastic about this model. And in fact, yes, the Kumeyaay are part Polynesian, as are many of the native Californian nations, and also in Arizona, for example. The largest nation of Arizona, the Tohono O'odham, are part Polynesian. If you go to the Herd Museum in Phoenix, you'll see many of the same crafts. If you go to the in Coolidge, there's the first U.S. national monument called Casa Grande, and you go into the Interpretive Center, they actually have the same annual tribute paying system that reconfirms who gets to use land and stuff like that. So the Polynesians did not end up only in Hawaii. They went all the way across the Pineapple Express. The prevailing trade winds came all the way to California, Mexico. In fact, Sinaloa itself is a Samoan name. You might know of Sinaloa, Mexico. There's plenty of evidence, and the anthropologists from UCSB say that, yeah, there's plenty of evidence for Polynesian roots, or mixture anyway, in what we call native Californian cultures, and that would go all the way up the coast. So what I'm showing, I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So what we're looking at now is the kind of a timeline. I've highlighted the ones that pertain to Native American linguistic rights, beginning with the 300 years of genocide. And then in 1924, finally, the civil rights of Native Americans were recognized, but still within an English-speaking context. Their human rights. It would take until 2007 for them to realize their human rights.
Excuse me, Michael, we don't see a timeline. Should we be?
Oh, do you see something that says, do you see my PowerPoint at this point?
No, you have to screen share again.
Okay, let's see, how do I? Can you see it now?
No.
You would stop the screen share to advance the slide, so I think you'd have to go back to the screen share and the Zoom and share it with us.
Okay, let me go back to that. I need to find my, okay, here we go. Thank you for helping me guiding through this. Here we go. Are we back on now?
Now we're good.
Okay. So I've highlighted in red some of the important dates. So moving on to 1974, the Native American Programs Act begins the federal funding. I said how in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the model was an integrative one, or an assimilationist model, I guess you would say. And then beginning in the 70s, they started thinking, okay, well, the languages are disappearing. We need to start helping them to preserve their languages. And then you can see in 1984, the first Canadian province, after, the Canada went through its period in the 70s when Quebec was going to secede. And so the rights of French, the linguistic rights of French were the first linguistic rights legislation incorporated in North America. And so in the 80s, now the Northeastern Territory renamed itself Nunavut and included that Nunavut language as an official language I should say Northeastern, but anyway, there's also Northwestern territories that did the same thing. And then 1987, the adoption of the Native American Languages Act, 1990 and the adoption of the Native American Languages Act was closely tied to the start of the Ahakunanoleo, the Hawaiian language program. And then we see in 1990, the Native American Languages Act begins to finance the preservation of 200 American languages through immersion education, which now this understanding that we need to teach the topics in the language for it to really stick. And then in 1996, we had the United Nations Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights were recognized as fundamental human rights. And then in 2003, Mexico recognized in their general law of Indigenous peoples' rights the equal validity of their 68 Indigenous languages. Then the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous comes out in 2007 to establish minimum standards. And then in 2014, the UN outcome document from the World Conference of Indigenous Languages establishes a schedule for its implementation. And then in 2014, so I failed to mention, in 1978, Hawaii was the first state to make its Indigenous language official. So in 2014, Alaska made their 20 Indigenous languages official with English. And then in 2016, Canada came out with their Indigenous Languages Act, which is kind of, appropriating what they did with French and including Indigenous languages. And then in 2019, South Dakota, that was a watershed year. The United Nations declared that year itself as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and South Dakota made its 3 dialects of Sioux official. And also that year, access to Hawaiian medium education became a right guaranteed by the state constitution. And this is, where we want to go in California, which would be the 4th state to do this. In 2000, so the International Decade for Indigenous Languages began last year, and then the Northwest Territories Official Language Act also in that same year recognized 9 Indigenous languages along with French and English. And then really, now that we've grown the number of Hawaiian speakers from a few hundred in the early 70s to over 30,000 today. Now Maui County, just the last election cycle, voted to make their government bilingual. This is the ultimate outcome. This is the end of this process of decolonization that United Nations began with its inquiries into this previously unnamed crime of genocide. So I just have some pictures of the happiness and pride this brings to everybody. It's not just the indigenous communities, but even European Americans who know about what happened over the previous centuries. And then there's South Dakota celebrating making their languages official. And then that's also the same year that Governor Newsom apologized for this. For many of you may not know, but during the gold rush, the federal government offered money for scalps, and so there was both a physical genocide and then an ongoing cultural genocide, linguicide. And then I talked about how now it's a constitutional right in Hawaii to receive a Hawaiian language education, regardless of your background. And many non-Hawaiians are taking advantage of this because it's not a subtractive process as the educational model was for Indigenous, where they had to give up their Indigenous language to learn English. The right model is to, for Indigenous peoples, is to raise them in immersion schools. They're going to learn English through osmosis, and in fact, they become better at it because they have, they're growing up bilingual. All bilingual students actually can speak, have better command of their English language when they have another language in their belt. And then 2019, by the way, in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's stated that after 2030, you're not even going to be able to define sustainability in the dominant or the colonial language alone. You're going to have to use the Indigenous languages. So what we're actually in the process of doing is creating an Indigenous language professional class. And I see there's a question, and I'd be happy to answer that now if that's okay with the people, with Tony. Les has a question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Michael, for doing this. I'm peripherally acquainted with the Kauai Sioux up in Kern County, and they currently have one living native speaker left. And I know that they are working very hard to preserve their language as best they can. And they work with the Master Apprentice program that is one way of learning languages. My question is here locally with the Kauai Sioux. I was watching that wonderful video of the school with all those kids in it and all those adults in it who are speaking in I don't know, I'm ashamed to say I don't know enough about the Kumeyaay population. Is there enough? I mean, I'm thinking of that one woman alive left speaking Nua from childhood. Is that something that could be replicated? The Hawaiian experience, could that be replicated here in San Diego County?
I recommend everyone Google Stanley Rodriguez's his doctoral dissertation. He identified at the time about 75 speakers of Kumeyaay, and that number is declining rapidly as the elder people pass on. And so what they've been doing is they've been what we did in Hawaii is we documented. We made recordings of what we call our mana leo, people who grew up speaking Hawaiian, for a variety of reasons, to teach us, proper syntax and there's a variety of reasons why you want to document your remaining speakers. But in New England, amongst the Wampanoag, they didn't have any speakers. All they had was I think when Harvard University started, they had reached out to the Wampanoag, and so they could produce a Bible. Well, they started with the Bible in their language, and now they have several speakers of Wampanoag. I don't know what the number is, but it's growing, and because of our numbers, yes, that process was accelerated, but it's not impossible. I mean, I think Israel didn't have any speakers of Hebrew when they started as well. So it's not an impossible task, but it's something that has to be cultivated. And there's a whole profession now in sociology called language planning, and the science of it is pretty well known. In fact, that brings us to the next step of our presentation. And all of this accumulated knowledge has been gathered into a working document for this international decade. And they've summarized that in this 5-minute video, and I'd like to show it to you now.
Language is essential to our well-being. Languages allow us to exercise our human rights and fundamental freedoms. They for daily existence and to building human connections. Through language, we can preserve our history, customs, and traditions, convey our thoughts, express ourselves in a language of our choice, and build our future. Worldwide, there are over 7,000 languages in use, and many of these are indigenous. But many languages are increasingly falling out of use, reflecting the vulnerable situation of indigenous peoples worldwide. This is happening for a number of different reasons: increased globalization, urbanization, migration, climate change, and many other factors are impacting the well-being of language communities and the changes in language vitality. Language users choose to switch to a dominant language to avoid discrimination, stigma, exclusion, or to have more economic and social opportunities. Leading global efforts to address this trend and building on the 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages, the United Nations has proclaimed the period 2022 to 2032 as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, with UNESCO acting as the lead UN agency. The decade is a global call to action to preserve, revitalize, and promote Indigenous languages around the world. It is only by working together and cooperating that the vitality and sustainability of linguistic diversity can be ensured. The International Decade will help build a better future, where Indigenous peoples are empowered to pass on their languages to the next generations. To reach this goal, UNESCO has worked with different partners to develop a global action plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which sets out a global framework for joint action and outlines the major steps that need to be taken in the next 10 years. Over the next 10 years, our efforts will focus on raising awareness to demonstrate the importance of linguistic diversity and multilingualism for societal development, encouraging legal recognition of languages and usage in justice, legislation, public administration, education, healthcare, digital development, employment, cultural heritage, biodiversity, sustainable food systems and Indigenous girls and women's empowerment, Indigenous peoples with disabilities, and strengthening partnerships. Ensuring the availability of the human, institutional, and financial resources that are needed to engage in joint action. This work will be done through policy formulation and implementation, capacity building of Indigenous peoples to learn, teach, and transmit their languages through community-based initiatives, enhancing the professional capacities of teachers, interpreters, translators, language specialists, and technology developers, development of multilingual content, tools, and resources, building institutional capacity, data collection for informed policy and decision-making, mechanisms for inclusion, participation, and partnerships. This decade of action will enhance global linguistic diversity and directly improve the lives of Indigenous language users, including youth, women, elderly people, and other professionals such as educators, who play a key role in the transmission of Indigenous knowledge, identity, culture, and worldviews. The Global Action Plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages establishes direct and indirect linkages with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN 2030 Agenda and contributes to achieving them. Actions between a wide range of stakeholders. The International Decade aims to achieve 4 main outcomes. 1, empower Indigenous peoples to learn, teach, and transmit their languages to current and next generations. 2, establish Indigenous languages as a global priority for social development peace building, and reconciliation by 2030. 3. See widespread legal recognition of Indigenous languages at the national level. 4. And develop an enabling environment through policymaking and strengthening institutions to provide adequate language services and resources. The International Decade of Indigenous Languages will contribute to building a brighter, sustainable, and multilingual future for Indigenous language users, leaving no one behind, no one outside by 2032.
So I love that video because it pretty much summarizes the program and the goals, and it's available on YouTube, and you just Google in IDIL 2022 to 2032, and there's even a shorter, like a a minute and a half version that introduces people to the idea. Last year, the kickoff in America was actually sponsored by the Cherokee, the Tsalagi speaking people. So they're making great inroads, and they're at the point now where they're even now being able to lead and inspire other First Nations in Oklahoma. Then USC last October sponsored a 5-day conference on the effects of the genocide for North American, I guess, all North and South American and Pacific peoples. And so there's a lot of interest academically on this, and it's really becoming a mainstream concern. And like I said, Maui now, through its planning department, is starting next year will begin to function bilingually. That's Maui County in Hawaii. The proposal was approved. So here in San Diego, by the way, I didn't mention this, but it's logical that efforts would begin here in San Diego because we have more Indian reservations than any county in the country. And so some of you might know Mel Vernon, who I've gotten to know over the years. He asked me, because I'm familiar with this process and I'm not a member of any one of the competing groups, that I might be a good person to lead the effort in California to have California's Indigenous languages recognized constitutionally so that they can be included in the state's educational mission. So our aim during this decade is to get legal recognition, and then to adopt to get the state to become sponsors of the efforts to revitalize the languages. So it's an expensive process, but when you consider the cost of not doing that in terms of the cost of social services to help people who suffer the malaise of cultural genocide, it's well worth the efforts. Plus, it makes us more interesting. We don't. I mean, one of the problems we deal with globalism is the homogenization of global culture. So there's many benefits besides biodiversity preservation, and the health of our neighbors, the people who've lived here for thousands of years. So to help this, and we're kind of in an educational phase. We launched some Facebook sites, facebook.com/, we have both America, California, and San Diego, LIL. And what I'm doing there is I'm posting updates of all the progress that's being made globally, but especially locally in these efforts. And then we're in the process now of forming a Blue Ribbon Commission that can help us to strategize our statewide campaign. Of course, you want to eventually see this happen nationally, But the good news is that City of San Diego is already on board. The mayor's office is going to help us to get county recognition. I mean, these things can happen on a local level before they happen on a state level. And at some point, we're going to have to identify the indigenous languages of our jurisdiction so that when it comes to time eventually to incorporating those languages in our economic development, processes, is that, that people know. And also it kind of puts people on notice that this is the time, if you haven't learned this language, if you want a career in the future, in public service, it's probably a good idea to incorporate some indigenous languages in your skills. So that concludes this presentation. I'm going to give you my phone number and email. If you are interested in serving in any capacity on this effort, we can use you. We're looking for corporate sponsors, people in all levels of Americans in California society, because I think it's going to take a pretty huge effort just to get the state recognition. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Feel free to use the raise hand feature, or as I said at the beginning, if you are not familiar with that feature, you can also wave frantically at the camera.
I'll take comments too. I have to thank some of those of you who have sponsored my presentation in the past. I think it's getting better as I continue to refine it through successive presentations. So any comments would be welcome at this point. Thank you.
Oh, no, you're going to, then I gotta leave. Okay. Oh my God.
There's a bunch of questions that are showing up on the chat.
Let's see, Elizabeth has a hand up also.
Yes, hi. One thing I just wanted to say, it's a comment, but I belong to San Diego 350, and the Kumeyaay have really been joining with us. I mean, they've also, I've been to the Kumeyaay Community College grounds because they've hosted us for some of our meetings and get-togethers. So I've really appreciated that, and I think I've also gone to their to the museum, Sikwan Museum, which is right near there too. That I think that really enlivens some of our movements here, because I think they're very environmentally conscious and environmentally active.
Indeed, and that's going to be part of the benefit, is learning from their traditional knowledge, not only learning from their traditional knowledge, but allowing them to participate in the way we define sustainability into the future. That's a very important concept for Rotarians. So
I think Betsy had her hand up.
Oh, Betsy, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry.
So if you were trying to persuade people that preserving indigenous languages and the values of indigenous people is important for somebody who's skeptical about that, who thinks, more languages just lead to more division, what would be like 3 or 4 points that you could make in a brief conversation?
Well, that's a really important question, and that has to do with really what it means to be a person versus an individual. Too often in our society, we identify ourselves as individuals, and we find all kinds of ways of of making us feel special, in whatever our particular interests are. However, as relational beings, we find our humanity. We find our humanity in acknowledging differences, and by honoring the deep ecology, the history of our state. I think we make the next step in our civilization. So it really becomes a value of what it means to be human in California.
Thank you.
I think, John, did you have a question?
Yeah, okay, yes. We've heard reports about how important the Navajo were in World War II for intelligence gathering and things like that. I was wondering if there's any support from the military now or interest in maintaining indigenous languages for that purpose.
Well, one of our Blue Ribbon Commission members is a commander in the military, and he's a Cherokee, and he's all behind this. So I would think that anything that that made us richer and more integrated and healed, as an American society. I mean, are we truly healed until we're all healed? I think it's just going to make American society stronger. We're going to all feel prouder to be Americans going through this process.
Nico, I see your hand up.
Hi, thanks. How's it going, Michael?
Hi, Nico. I see your question. Would you like me to read it to the group?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to restate that, or if you just want to read it, that works too. I mean, basically, as a teacher, I'm interested if there's active programs here in California to create Indigenous language curricula or institutions, like the one that you showed the video that was made in Hawaii. It looks like that's pretty like you made it happen, and I'm just wondering if there's any active initiatives here in California to either fund or to support those kind of initiatives. And do you know of any here in San Diego?
Good question. So the tribes that are lucky enough to have casinos have begun this process already. However, most of the California tribes don't have oil resources and things like that bring in the kind of income that can fully implement these programs. And in fact, in Hawaii, if it wasn't for the state's participation, there's no way we could have gotten to the point where we're at. So it's really a question of civil rights now. And now that we've recognized them in our Native communities and their human rights, they have equal rights to develop as Indigenous peoples, and therefore we ought to allocate the funds. Now, in terms of how many languages that means we do, that's a part of the question that the tribes are going to have to figure out, because if they want to see success, I don't know if we're going to be able to do 40 different languages, but there are 6 main groups. So that's going to be the difficult part, is getting through and listening the cooperation so that satisfactory progress can be made.
Well, this is, I think, part of my question, though, is there's making an institution to do it, but there's also the curriculum side. And a lot of curriculum these days is becoming more and more inquiry and project-based. And so it could actually be that the students themselves are the ones documenting the different languages and vernacular, and like actually using project-based learning to go out and interview and create repositories of the elders in their communities that still hold those languages.
Absolutely. And that's how it started in Hawaii. The first step, I didn't review it in the timeline, but the first step was just to have a standardized degree. What did it mean to be proficient in Hawaiian? And once then we got to that point, then we started offering courses in curriculum development. I was in one of those courses where I wrote my urban design curriculum after being in 4th year Hawaiian. I was at a point where I could converse and talk about general learning outcomes, et cetera. And so, but the first step in the process is developing the capacity to be conversational, and then it's always a part of your first year curriculum to demonstrate something. You have to show somebody how to do something in the language. And so it happened, on smaller scales, but then when it got to the point where we had to get to academic standards, it required a higher level of fluency in the Hawaiian language. But this is just part of the process that they have to go through. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then the part in chat was more around just, are there, like, has the Tribal Alliance of Sovereign Indian Nations put forth funds to help with schools like that? I know they get a lot of casino money and stuff like that, and they're pretty active in California politics, but it seems like there could be revenue streams to pay for developing that kind of curriculum.
Absolutely. And like I said, some of them already have begun that. So I know Sikwan has an immersion school, so does Pechanga. And we want to certainly encourage what they're doing. What they're doing really is creating like the first generation of new speakers of their languages. And so they're kind of like where we were back in the 1980s, 1986, or actually 1984 is when here in California, there's a whole network of Hawaiian civic clubs, and they were kind of passing the plate to finance the cost of a bus to pick up the children so they could meet in a park, because it was at the time illegal to meet in the schools. So it was still illegal to use Hawaiian as a medium of instruction. So Stan's at the point now where he's looking for money for buses, so that's where he's at in the process, and we should be very, very proud of him and encourage him and all of his students to stay on this path. It's really helpful. It's healing for all of us, really.
And Michael, thank you for being here with us tonight. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. We appreciate you very much. Again, thanks for being here all. And our next installment in the Adult Speaker Series, we will welcome back Peter Boland, who will talk to us about women's reproductive rights, which, as you know, are being challenged in a lot of places. So that will be on March 23rd, same time, same place, and you can look for that on our Adult RE page of our website. So once again, thank you so much, Michael, and have a good night all.
Aloha. Thank you so much for allowing me to share with you.
Thank you.